Welcome to another episode of the Roundtable. Today we're going to be talking about modes of communication, and it could dive into ways that us as athletes and individuals can learn and take on information. So, as coaches, we, especially online, we have modes of communication that we kind of lean upon, and most of them are going to be text format, video, diagrams, voice message, things like that, right? So today I kind of wanted to just dive into, I guess, what our bread and butter is, what we prefer using, why we want to use them for certain types of situations, and kind of talk about why we're going to lean into these modes, right? So I'll open this up. Shania, did you want to go first? Let's talk about what's your current like bread and butter that you kind of use with most of your clients in terms of communication.
I think the bread and butter, like I always revert to, is just like text, like basic text. I feel like the other forms are like either videos, voice messages, is just like highly dependent on like the individual client and like how they like to learn. So I think I always revert to just like, reply back by text. And then as I get to know the client, or it just depends on like what I'm working on with them, that will determine what method I then kind of use. Um, so I guess like for example, like I'll voice message if I'm having a little bit more of like a blunt kind of conversation, so they can kind of hear my voice. Whereas I think that can get a little bit um like skewed when you just like sort of type if you're having like a bit more of like not a harsher conversation, but you kind of just either like trying to pull them up for something, or you're talking about a comp plan, or like what talking about what it's going to look like post comp, and then like a long term sort of plan. I'll voice message it. Um, and then, like, if I'm kind of trying to explain a specific movement or some form of technical breakdown, to like an easy example would be like either start end position on a squat, either like at the start of it or in the hole in the bottom of the squat. I'll use like more of like a screenshot diagram, like arrows, lines, that kind of stuff. So it's like more of a visual. So I guess it kind of just like the method that I use depends on what I'm working on with that client specifically.
Yeah, I agree. Like I like using it's like I'm pretty much bang on exact same as you, Shania, like in terms of being versatile with the mode that you use. Like I'm not really what's the word? Sold on one type of communication and solely using that throughout like the duration with the client because it really depends on what you're working through, right? I like how you've brought up using voice messages for like harsher conversations. Like I feel like that's something I'm kind of like always thinking about, like especially when you need to deliver something. For example, like you've been a bit more lax for a long period of time and you need to bring them up, and it's like sometimes when it's just solely through text, you miss that like tone of voice, right? And it could come off as like a bit too harsh. So I think you bring up the point of like voice messages actually a good way of using voice messages aside from just like general preferences.
Yeah, I think too, like voice messages can even be used for like, even if it's like you needing to have more of like an empathetic conversation. So if it's like, a client's dealing with like a niggle or an injury, or, you're trying to show some form of like empathy and that you understand how they're feeling, voice messaging allows you to kind of get that message over a little bit, I guess, like better, because again, they can hear your tone of voice and like how, or like what you're trying to explain and trying to relate to them in that moment. And I think too, like your form of like, the method that you're going to use to communicate is also going to be dependent on like where the client's at as well. Like I think, naturally as coaches, when it's like, someone's directly in a comp prep, we're not really making a whole heap of technical changes. Like, they're 4 or 5 weeks out. We're not going to be telling them to, change this, change that. So I think then it's usually more where either like voice messaging or like just like text is used. Whereas outside of comp prep specifically, that's where we obviously are trying to make more of like the technical changes, the cues, things like that. So I guess more again like voice messages or diagrams, screenshots are going to be used in communication, because you can actually like explain something and they can like visually see what you're trying to explain at the same time.
Yeah. I wanted to go into those certain kind of like situations, right? Because I've got a couple listed here. Like we've got technical feedback, competition plans, ideas and concepts, and actionable steps. So you've outlined it pretty well, but I wanted to dive a bit deeper into it. So, first off, we've got technical feedback. You mentioned like it's usually going to happen outside of a competition prep. And I think for me, when I think about it, right, like you don't want to get stuck in the middle where it's like half understood by the client and then they like misapply it because it's getting lost in translation. So I think making sure that communication is very thorough to the point where it's like they understand what you're trying to communicate, even if it's like the words that you're saying don't really matter in the sense that you could use whatever cue as long as they understand what's happening and what they want out of it, right? So like that's where diagrams are helpful. Like if you're trying to tell them, like for example, like say on a squat and you're trying to work on stacking, right? You could say like I want you to stack the rib cage over the pelvis, but you might not have an understanding of what that might mean, right? Some people don't have that kinesthetic awareness to be able to move themselves in that position. Whereas if you just draw two arrows and say like connect these 2 points together, they can visualize that a bit better. Sam or Dave, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Okay, I'm gonna go. I'm instead of cutting Sam off. Yeah, I completely agree. I think like diagrams can be super helpful in situations like that. And when we're talking about understanding, I guess like the client understanding what you're trying to get across and being on the same page, sometimes I'll find that if a cue isn't really sticking or like what I'm trying to get them to do isn't really sticking, that's when it can be really helpful for me to like, I don't know, film something in the gym of me doing it and then jump on CapCut or something and just voice over it and show them exactly what I mean step by step and voice over the top of it at the same time. And then it's like super, super clear. And there's no other way to interpret it besides like what's on the screen with me voicing over the top and showing it, either zooming in or slow-moing or drawing arrows or whatever it is. But that's usually like if what I'm saying doesn't sink in, like if it's, the third time being like, hey, try this, try that, or I'm saying the same thing a different way for the, third, fourth time or whatever, then I'm like, okay, let's just try and see if this option works. And that's where I might film an actual video dedicated to what they're struggling with.
Yeah. I think the main thing, kind of like programming and technique, right? There is no real like set rule that works. And you can find that like the most unconventional thing or cue can work for a client in terms of them being able to understand, how to apply it to their own body. I think probably the funniest example I've got is I was talking about like breath and bracing on bench. And I don't know how I ended up thinking about it or how I even came to saying it, but I ended up saying like, imagine you're in public and you're trying to let out a fart really like slow and silently. That's kind of like what you want to do, like with your bench when you're doing repetitions. And like all of a sudden it took that client like to say that to understand not to let too much air out in between reps, right? And like that just came to me. And then all of a sudden I go, okay, well, maybe I need to start thinking of like simpler or like funny or like imagery kind of ways to explain like powerlifting technique and positions for that client. And then you kind of go, all right, that's more like their communication style. They don't want to learn about the nitty gritty specific positions of the rib cage and everything. They just want to learn, imagine doing this, or you imagine doing this, you know what I mean? So I think it obviously depends on the client and like how well they can understand what you're saying. And that could be a spectrum of like super, super technical or the complete opposite, relating it to farting in public, which I love. It's good. It's great. Um, and then, yeah, I think like it also depends, just talking about like technical feedback and stuff, like where they're at starting with you. Um, I find probably for the most part, when I first start with someone, my feedback will be more videos of me doing stuff for them, diagrams, arrows, screenshots of their technique, the more kind of detailed imagery side of communication for feedback and technical advice. And then as they progress through their time with me, it'll be more like shorter, sharp communication, like heading into a comp prep, like just shorter, sharper feedback that's more relative to their performance. Um, so yeah, like overall bread and butter, starting off with more like detailed variety of kind of communication styles. And then as you progress with them, you can be more like direct and straight to the point.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to how you're talking about like everyone has like a different kind of personality and what gets absorbed from them, right? So like you've got your
Mm.
person who just doesn't take on as much like of the technical jargon, and you have to find more creative ways to communicate that. And then there's people on the other side who like want to know exactly what's going on. And I think like for myself, me personally, like I really enjoyed that aspect of things when I first started out, and it was like, oh, like when you're benching, you want to maximize like thoracic expansion and maximize posterior compression and all these kinds of words. I was like, oh, okay. Like it just made sense to me, right? And I like, and then everything would kind of like, I guess, diverge, and I'd think of different ways that I could word it. But I was like, okay, like it's all feeding into these two concepts, right? But for some people, like just bringing up those concepts is just gonna go over their heads because it just doesn't apply. And I think it's, I guess, like how much, what's the word, like enthusiasm you have for like sports science, biomechanics kind of thing. Like if you are already in that realm, you're communicating on common ground. Whereas if you're not really, looking at biomechanics and things like that on a daily basis, you would much rather prefer simpler language, diagrams, things like that, right?
Well, yeah, I think that sort of ties into like there's sort of, I guess, four different avenues of clients from a perspective of like you're either gonna work with someone who is a coach, so they're gonna like love the like technical feedback and like all the like the fancy words, or you're gonna work with someone who's just like an athlete who just wants to lift, right? So they don't really care that much, like they just want to be like told how to get strong kind of thing. Or they just like aren't self-aware, like they're not like biomechanical aware, so they're not going to understand it. And then it's kind of like on the other end, you then have, I guess, like this kind of ties into clients who overthink or don't overthink. So I think again, it's like if the client is a very like that they're going to overthink, it's like you're probably not going to give them a whole heap of cues to think about because you're just going to overwhelm them. Like you're probably likely going to show more of like just one diagram and like one little analysis or voice message that's like, hey, like we need to find this position, not this position, and then they can just visually see it, and then like that's kind of it. Or it's like the client who doesn't overthink and does like to receive a whole heap of feedback and they want to know the whys. That's where you're probably going to give them a little bit more, right? So it's kind of like, I guess, like yeah, like four different like clients that you kind of get to like you obviously have to experience and like work with and like figure out who needs what and when.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in my head like what you just mentioned. So you had like the coaching kind of perspective. You had like a beginner. You had someone who's not as not as aware of what they're doing, and then you
Yeah.
also have like overthinkers. Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
So, like with that, right? Like, and we'll tie it to like I guess other situations. With you tied up like overthinkers really well. People need to have it very simplified, but then there's also people who need that communication like pretty much in depth, so they are also bought into those concepts. And I think like another thing that I thought of is like ideas and concepts, right? Because like you can't really draw a diagram for example, like progression models. Well, like you could, but at the same time, like it's gonna end up being like a written format anyways, right? So like there's some things that are essentially just models, and if you can explain it well, it will tie into what they're trying to achieve long term. And I think like that applies for explaining why like you want to stay on target with your RPEs, concepts like that, right? Like concepts about like competition plans, like here's what happens if you're trying to be too aggressive or too conservative. So some concepts do end up requiring just being written, but it'll end up playing towards like getting an overall understanding of what I want as a coach, so then they can try apply that when like you're not available. Sweet. What else do we have? One thing we touched upon is like competition plans, and we've also got Zoom as a form of communication. So like not just video, but like instant video communication, right? So I think one major advantage of that is you're able to get all these micro changes done at a very quick basis. For us as coaches, like I think it's like we've also value our time, and so, for example, like the times when I like to use like instant video messaging or like conference calling is like post competition when you're looking to make like the big changes after a competition and after you've reviewed a block, like you're going from peaking to like a volume block, and you're trying to maximize like buy-in from the client, like, hey, this worked last block, and like we could keep this in, or maybe we need to change this, right? So making all those micro changes rather than like, hey, I've made this block, let me know what you think, and then they go and check it. I think that's a good time to also like recommunicate and set boundaries, and all these little things that build a positive relationship between coach and athlete is a good time to do that. As well as the competition day itself, like discussing attempts and all that. Do you have thoughts on that as well, Sam?
Yeah. Yeah, I think last week when I spoke about that client who didn't have the best comp for squat and deadlift, we jumped on the call like the Monday after the competition and worked through what happened on the competition, but then also like figuring out and working collaboratively together to talk about what worked and what didn't work in the prep. And then basically we just like sat down and wrote his next block together. So I think like instant conference calling in that sense is really powerful because you get like a lot done in a short amount of time in terms of like being able to work together and yeah, be collaborative in that approach. But then yeah, also just like you said, like kind of building that trust and building that positive relationship between the coach and athlete. The other time I've done that would be like before a competition as well for like athletes who like aren't quite confident, or if it's their first competition or their second competition. Like I've done it a few times, like jumping on a call and working through the comp plan and the attempts together. So like pulling up the comp plan, working out warm-ups, showing them how like the warm-up timing works, and then physically going through like A, B, and C options together. So they kind of know what to expect based off how they were training and what to expect on the platform too. Just to settle the nerves as much as possible. So that, yeah, like we talked about in previous roundtables, like they just have one job then, that's to go out there and lift. So you're kind of clearing all that anxiety about numbers and expectations and goals well in advance. So yeah, I think conference calling is really powerful in that sense. Doesn't take much to jump on a call, and then I guess like as coaches we can just use it to yeah be more efficient in that sense and get a lot covered in a short amount of time.
Yeah, sweet. And I guess to finish things off, I wanted to talk about you guys personally as like athletes, what you prefer as modes of communication, right? Like aside from you and your coach, like are there certain ways that you find yourself biasing towards to like learn certain topics? Dave, did you want to start off with this one?
Sure, I'll jump in. So I would say I'm a really chill athlete. Like I don't need much from my coach. I can just sort of, get the program, follow it, and maybe just get told like, hey, like yeah, yesterday is a good example. Like I overshot my top tempo single horrifically. Um, so just being pulled up on things like that instead of being like, oh, it's whatever, it's bench. I can be blasé about it. So I think I prefer being, I guess, like in terms of modes of communication. I'm not too fast. I can take whatever, whether it's voice messages, whatever. I just prefer being pulled up on things that I'm not doing right. So however that happens, I'm easy. If it is diagrams, voice messages, whatever. As long as it happens, then I'm completely cool. Same with technique feedback. Doesn't matter if the feedback's via voice or message or whatever. I'm pretty relaxed about that, and I feel like just because I have I guess, a background knowledge in the coaching space, I can absorb anything that comes my way, whether it's through text or video or voice or whatever. It doesn't really matter too much.
Yeah, nice. Shania?
I think I'm pretty similar to Dave. I think like given that like Steve's my coach and like being a part of Perf, like a lot of what I learn is either from him directly or Perf or like a little bit external. So I think the personal development as like a coach and an athlete is just there. I think um from Steve it's like similar, like it's just kind of getting pulled up for like, yeah, if you're just doing things wrong, or like I guess what I've noticed the most is sometimes I'll just have a tendency to like get somewhat complacent with lifts that I'm really comfortable with, like squat and deadlift, like because they always kind of just like flow for me now. It'll be like the start of the block, like just like, not treating it how I should. So just like little pull ups like that here or there if I need it. But I think like a lot of the time, if Steve kind of gives anything technical, it's kind of mainly just through message, and then I kind of just have the ability to like I understand and know what he's saying, and then I can just go back and self-analyze my videos and like see what he said, see where I've gone wrong, and then I can kind of just fix it in the next session. Um, so I find that pretty simple. Like I don't really need a lot of like diagrams or voice messages or things like that. So yeah, I'm pretty chilled. Like even like comp stuff, it's just like I kind of just go into comp already really knowing what I want. Steve kind of is the same, like the plan's there. I think I said to you at Newcastle Barbell, it's like Steve never really asks me how I am or how I'm feeling, so I'm always just gonna tell him I'm good. So we don't really communicate like really at all leading into comp, but that's just like something personal to me. It's like he'll wait for me to message him to be like, all right, like I'm on or like I'm feeling good, whether it's like, into like squat warm ups and things like that. And then he kind of knows where I'm at. Whereas if he asks, I'm always just gonna lie, I guess, even if I don't feel good, which I think is just like common for like any athlete. So
You just say you're good.
like, you never want to admit that like you don't feel good. So he just like doesn't really bother to like message me prior to that, which is fine and it just works.
Yeah. To add to that, like I remember going through this period where it's like I didn't want to tell him that I don't feel good. So then
Yeah.
I'll just live through it and I'm just slogging through training and he'll go like how are you feeling? I was like, to be honest, I don't feel good. And he goes, you could always just say that, right? I'm like, oh, okay. So that got me a bit more honest as well. To touch on that, like I think I'm in a similar boat to you too. Like it's gotten to the point now where I don't require as much diagrams and things like that. Like I think from start to finish, it's always been either a combination of like text or voice messaging through Steve. And so yeah, like just picking up things over time and going out and practicing what Steve wants me to do like outside of training. So like constantly visualizing those actionables, I think for me has been very helpful.
Yeah,
Sam,
definitely.
what's up?
I'm just laughing because your face is frozen and like
Ah, is it?
you're
Oh
talking and
no.
you yeah, no, it's fine.
All good. Let me reset it.
Um,
But yeah, you go, Sam. There we go.
oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Hey, Danny. Yeah, so for me, like obviously working with Kelly for 4 to 5 years. Initially we started face to face, like with like weekly sessions. So like we nutted out a lot of techniques, sort of stuff, having that face to face time. And then obviously as I progressed in my experience level, I didn't need all those kind of details as much. Um, Obviously working together and having a lot of face to face time here at Perf, a lot of our communication was just like in conversations at the start of the training week, kind of like what to expect numbers wise, how everything was kind of feeling. And then I would kind of go off from there. Um, and then just recently, so just changing coaches, started working with Jason. It's a different model, so it's a weekly feedback model. So I guess, I'm 4 weeks or 4 or 5 weeks in now. I think probably the one thing I've noticed, which I've kind of enjoyed, is like with the weekly feedback, I'm getting like one, two, three, one or two things at a time for each lift to kind of work on. And then I'm making that the focus for the next lift. So especially like coming out post worlds, tech's being a little bit clunky, bench press isn't quite feeling that flash, all that kind of stuff. Just like standard kind of detrained technique kind of problems. But having the weekly feedback and just kind of giving like one thing to work on and then making that the focus for the next week, I've found pretty powerful. And then now it's come to like week 4, week 5. I've spent like the last 4 weeks working on one thing at a time for bench. I've now able to kind of string it all together. Now bench is feeling really good. So it's just kind of like broken up the process of like working on technique by 1 week at a time, if that makes sense. I think I rambled a bit there, but hopefully that makes sense. And then, yeah, like just with that weekly feedback, a lot of communication is just in terms of, what's lining up and how the program's structured, what I have next week and all those kind of details. So not too much technical feedback, but it's been enough to kind of clean up my performance and how I was moving post world and having some time off, which has been good. I think one thing I also used the other day was like a bar path tracker for bench, which I haven't used myself with clients at all. But basically like filming straight side on with bench, he used like a bar path kind of software to show like kind of where I was pressing and it was a set where like one rep felt good and the other rep didn't feel so good. And then like with the bar path tracker, I was had like that kind of real detailed imagery of where the bath was heading, and I could also think back to what I did on that set. Um, and again, that was also just feedback that I was able to take on into the next training week and like fix straight away. So that was pretty useful too. But yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think that brings up a really good point that we didn't discuss yet. I think like um what's the word? Like immediacy of like delivery of feedback, that can also change as well, right? Like so if you're a really beginner athlete, or you're just starting out, I think there's a lot of variances in your technique. And so having someone there to be able to pull you up on each rep as it goes is really powerful, because everything looks different when you're a beginner, right? Whereas as you start getting more advanced, you're getting more consistent, and therefore like you're chunking like sets across sets, right? Like and a little deviation in a rep is more so like what's the word? It happens occasionally rather than every rep, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned like now that you're getting weekly feedback, I think you're able to. It sounds like you're able to take that on and apply it throughout the whole week, making sure that you're still keeping most of your techniques still like fundamentally sound, right? Whereas
Yeah.
this will tie into like overthinkers or beginners, where it's like if you're giving like one piece of feedback at the start of the week, and like this may or may not apply, but this is how it works in my head. Like if you're not receiving the immediate feedback when you're just starting off, you're not it's not going to stick as much, right?
Mm.
Because like you work on this one thing, but then you're accidentally changing another thing somewhere else in the body. So yeah.
Like I
I,
think that ties into like I don't know if I can talk for everyone, but I know personally, like I just like when you're providing technique feedback, it needs to be like layered on, right? Like you've got to
mm,
like especially with like beginners or just like any lifter, it's like you've got to pick like the lowest hanging fruit, as we've I'm sure has been said a number of times, but you've got to pick that and then like be able to give the client the feedback, and then like if you are like for us, for example, like when we're talking to clients, multiple times a week, and they're benching, squatting, deadlifting, how many times a week, you can't kind of give them something new every single time you talk to them in that 1 week. Like you need to give them one new cue or like one piece of technical feedback, and then give them time to apply that, because otherwise that just leads to the overthinking, like them that criticizing their lifts rather than like just like being able to like observe and notice what's happening. And then just like layer on as you kind of see each technique or each new cue sort of become applied and then become consistent with it. And then it's like, okay, then if there's still some sort of breakdown happening, what's next? And like, what's the new cue, or like, what's the next sort of technical feedback I need to give? So I think that's a really big thing that like I do, especially with like my demographic of clients that I work with.
Yeah. I was very much like when I first started coaching, I was always thinking like how can I give as much value as I can, right? So it'd be like layering on too fast. And then things
mm.
just don't stick. But then now I'm like more comfortable with focusing on building this one solid piece of foundation in the technique really well before moving on.
Mm. I think you just covered that quickly before, but like using like the client's feedback to also kind of highlight to them what went well in each set when there is that variance from good and bad techniques. So like if they're sending videos and one set they said it felt good, etc., etc., and then the other set didn't feel so good, you can use their language and kind of reinforce what happened in that set from a technical standpoint, like pick one to two things and say, yep, this set was good because of XYZ. And you can say, on this set, you did this instead. I think kind of using their feedback in terms of what, yeah, felt good and what didn't feel so good, and then applying the technical cues on top of that can also help the client kind of understand what they're doing in each of those sets. Again, depending on their experience level, but yeah, I think that's pretty useful too. Tying
Yeah,
on
for
from like
sure.
the one thing at a time.
Yeah. But yeah, I think overall we covered communication quite well. To tie things off, like there's a lot of different ways that you can communicate with people. It's finding what works as well as the best way that you can communicate it from your perspective. And then as you start getting more advanced, like sometimes you won't need that immediacy of feedback anymore, and you can start to get better at chunking information and the way it works best for you in your mind. But yeah, thanks guys for listening to another episode of the Roundtable. We will see you next week.
Sweet. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks.
Thanks, Danny.